Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a recovering public servant here on Kaurna land. And joining me today are two fellow recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And from Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
Hi, ladies. So let's begin by just acknowledging that we took a little winter hiatus. So thank you, listeners, for your patience in awaiting a new episode.
Back around the trestle now.
Indeed, Christmas tablecloth and all. And the other thing we want to let you know is we've established a LinkedIn page for the podcast. If you just search the Westminster Tradition and give us a follow there, you can stay up to date with other interesting articles and things that we find, as well as keeping on top of when we're about to publish an episode.
Brilliant.
So, on Friday, the Australian Public Service Commissioner, Gordon de Bruer, released a report of a specially convened task force to follow up on referrals from the quote-unquote sealed section of the Robodebt Royal Commission report. So we're going right back to our earliest topic here, Robodebt. The APSC has investigated 16 people and made findings against 12. This is almost the last investigation that will occur as a result of the Royal Commission. So pretty much the last opportunity for consequences for the architects of Robodebt. Before we get into it, Danielle, can you catch us up on where things are at more generally vis-a-vis the sealed section?
Absolutely, Alison. Can I also say that hopefully at the end of this episode it's the last time we ever have to use the phrase sealed section, because I have never, ever, as a Dolly Cosmo girl of the early 90s, been comfortable with that being the name of what was in the report. Much less funny. In June, the National Anti-Corruption Commission discontinued its investigations into 6 people, 5 of which were public servants and 1 of which was not. Their fundamental reason was that they felt it would not add any value in the public interest. They were really saying that they could not find, or it was unlikely that they would find any additional evidence that had not been found in the Royal Commission, which, I mean, really, as we know, it was a very forensic investigation. The witnesses that gave evidence it was very extensive, and so I think there's some truth to the fact that it was unlikely they were going to find more than the Royal Commission had already found. They also were concerned about duplicating other investigations, and we're going to talk a bit about themes later, but I think the mess of this is something that at a structural level we're going to have to really start to think about in relation to all of the agencies. And it had nothing additional to add in terms of sanctions. So it would just be referring them back off in a circular spiral motion back to the APSC and other institutions that had already investigated or were currently investigating individuals involved. Rick Morton has spoken really eloquently about the fact that one of the things the NAC could do was find that the conduct was corrupt publicly. Which in itself would have been significant. Yeah, it would have been really significant. There are some further steps on that. So a number of complaints were received by the inspector of the NAC. So the NAC has its own watchdog. Again, keen to talk about mess later in relation to layers. The NAC has its own inspector. She has received, Ms Gail Finesse, SC, has received a huge number of complaints and has decided to investigate the NAC process.
Interesting.
Particularly in relation to issues of recusal. So there are questions of whether recusal was done early enough by the NAC commissioner. Oh, goodness me, so many commissioners. There was also a referral to the AFP that ended in July. So that was about a witness who could have potentially provided false testimony to the Royal Commission. The AFP announced in July that they had decided there was insufficient evidence to prove that the person had intended to mislead the Royal Commission. There remains, and again, both mess and timeliness is something worth talking about. There are still the legal practitioners boards, and they're called different things in different jurisdictions, There were referrals to them around the conduct of some of the people who were legal practitioners who also have another authorising kind of environment on top of the public sector, and they have not completed those. So I think we can still expect some outcome from that. So pending the legal practitioner review type process and maybe the inspector of NAC finding something in relation to the process, we seem to be at the end of the investigation referral outcomes processes as of Robodebt, unless a class action lawsuit against the individuals is launched, which the Commissioner herself did leave it as an open option.
Yeah, right. But wait, there's more.
But wait, there's going to be more.
Yeah.
So the APSC report came out only a couple of days ago, and I haven't quite had a chance to dig into it in the way that you two ladies have. Caroline, what were the findings of that report?
Yeah, so the APSC used quite an interesting process, and if you really are an investigation nerd process, I encourage you to go read the report. Danielle's nodding because she, of course, has. But I won't go through that now. But in the end, they ended up investigating 16 public servants based both on the direct referrals from the sealed section and then also because they read the whole report and some of the secretaries of agencies went, well, adverse comments were made about people who work for me and I think we should look at those. And then also because Commissioner Holmes didn't refer any former public servants for investigation, and in the end they went through. So they ended up with 16. And overall, they found that 12 people had breached the APS Code of Conduct. And it's a mix of current and former people who were found to do that. And by the end, there's only 4 public servants left in that 12, like the other 8 all kind of exited at some point. And they were found to have breaches of things like behaving with honesty and integrity, breaches of acting with care and diligence. That was the biggest one. That's the one that...
42 breaches.
Yeah. And it sort of feels like everyone got that one, right? There were a smaller number of breaches around providing false or misleading responses to official requests for information. One expects that might relate to the Ombudsman's reports in both 2017 and 2019. And then there were a very large number of breaches around upholding values of APS and the integrity and good reputation of the APS and agencies. So a lot of breaches across those 12 people as described.
And so did they go into any specifics about the nature of those breaches?
Yeah, so there's an interesting discussion around anonymity that we might want to have later. But in general, there was a kind of cover note from Gordon de Brewer, the Public Service Commissioner, who talks about the kind of sorts of findings or the sorts of activities that led to these breaches. And they all sound quite familiar to me, except there's one that really stuck out to me as one that I hadn't thought about. So the first one is around failing to exercise proper diligence in preparing policy, legal or implementation advice.
I have a highlighter and I want to talk about this next to that one. So
yes.
Keep going.
No, bring it on. We can just do them as we go through, Dee.
Well, so what I ended up with those, the ones that they have identified, is there are ones that I think are really obvious. So obvious things that we maintain are obligations of all public servants. And then there are others that I think the wash up and the socialisation of this is they are expansions of what I think most public servants might think of as misconduct. And so
Great. So I should read through them and we should try and think as I go through them, like which ones of these fall into your kind of, that's a typical
obvious
one.
Yeah. Do that be bad?
Right.
And then the others where I'm like, whoa, like if I was to apply that to every piece of work I've ever seen, I'm not sure how that goes. And then some of it around what's the practical application of some of them.
Brilliant. All right. Okay. So number 1, failing to exercise proper diligence in preparing policy, legal or implementation advice. This is, of course, sending cab subs up that contain blatantly illegal things without proper legal. So something like that. Number 2, failing to inform others or escalate a matter when the person had a reasonable concern that the policy was unlawful or the advice was inaccurate.
That's interesting in the context of what we've heard about, I guess, the cultural pressure on people not to escalate or what happened to them when they did, like Colleen, which is got nowhere and she...
Yeah.
I do think that one's more obvious though. I mean, the inaccurate blurry. The not saying you think something's unlawful, I think that one's reasonably clear cut.
Yeah, and when I think about inaccurate, I think about, like, we all know senior public servants who have been sacked after giving their minister, you know, the wrong piece of information that they read out in a press conference or similar.
Yeah.
The third one, this one, expressly directing staff not to consult or collaborate with others who had a direct interest in the matter relevant to the accuracy of the advice. Don't talk to the lawyers.
Yeah.
Don't talk to the operations people.
Or don't talk to that companion department.
Yes.
See, it's that one, though, that I think is more interesting. I think don't talk to the lawyers. That falls in the obvious.
Yeah.
Yes,
it's always a fault to say
as a fault
Yeah.
and an obvious breach. I read in that the second piece is, like, are we actually obligated to call XYZ other department? Or, look, it sits with us and it da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We can, like, in my lane, like, I don't know if that is obvious to everyone that it would be a breach to say, look, it's our responsibility. Please don't call health, education, whoever the other, you know, relevant agency is. I think that is a slight expansion of people's thinking.
And it's about, so it's failure to consult or collaborate in the matter relevant to the accuracy of the advice. So those people
narrow
have
scope.
information that is relevant to what you put up. That is interesting.
How do I know they've got relevant information?
Yeah, until I talk to them. Oh, good question.
Chicken
This
and
next
egg.
one,
Yeah.
this one is the one.
I want to know
that,
how we
I can't
operationalise this one.
Yeah. Failing to consider the impact on and capacity of staff and work quality when setting timeframes.
Holy moly.
That's a misconduct.
Not doing that is misconduct. That is going to, if we start putting these, whatever, I haven't got numbers next to them, of course, these 6, 7 dot points as some of the standards and start socialising them and working through them with public service, that, I think, is going to break some brains around it's your responsibility as a leader to go, is it humanly possible for the teams I've got in the timeframes I've got with the skills they've got to get this done?
Yeah.
Instead of...
To a sufficiently high quality.
Instead of the usual default position, which is...
Minister wants it by Tuesday. Minister will have it by Tuesday.
It can be done.
Probably.
It can be done. Like, the idea that... I think that one of the most common things you hear when people are building up leaders is, like, no one likes a can't be done culture.
Yeah.
Always have to find a way. Bring in people from other parts. Like, it's not always just a do or die. There's usually, like, multiple solutions. But this idea about this considering impact of capacity, work quality in timeframes, that's a big shift, and I'd be really interested to see how people start to socialise that and figure out what they're going to do about it.
And to be clear, not saying it shouldn't be.
Oh,
Yes. No.
Right? But very different to some of the behaviour I think we've all observed.
And obviously it links to the outcomes, right? So it's like, it's probably fine to set your teams unreasonable timelines and give them work they can't complete in that time to a high quality if you're not establishing a nationwide scheme that's going to shake down people for their money, right? Like, I think it's a kind
tenor of risk.
Yeah. It's not
Seriousness.
just... Yeah. The consequences of that are that you ended up with an illegal scheme. The next three, I think, feel much more like things we would know, which are misleading ministers and senior officials on matters related to lawfulness or accuracy, failing to disclose relevant material to an integrity agency, and failing to act on lawfulness or truthfulness given all the information that a person has gained over a reasonable period of time.
They all feel obvious to me.
Yeah.
I know, but I think that last one really calls out what we observed in some of the witnesses, which is that notwithstanding that they continually acquired more and more information about the AAT appeals or feedback from operational staff, they kind of stuck with their initial position.
Yeah. Heads down, bums up. Don't look.
Yeah, and I think
how much
I think that one's
information do I
actually
need?
really important
Yeah,
to say it is an obligation on all of us to continue rethinking the decisions and choices that we have made as more information becomes available.
Ooh, what I
Like
really...
making that an explicit obligation is actually quite important.
So you've really, I suppose you're zeroing in on the over a reasonable period of time.
Yeah.
Which is also not often how the process works. Because minutes or advices are produced at a point in time.
Yes.
And they may reference other things, But there is something here that's that obligation for almost like what you've discovered over a period of time, maybe in another role or...
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is a little bit different often to how people operate, which is the advice I've just been given by the person underneath me, the point in time.
I mean, can you imagine writing a minute to a minister that says, I refer you to my previous minute of X date months or years ago, and I have now acquired additional information that renders that advice.
It would be brave.
It would be brave. To quote, yes, Minister.
Yeah.
But this is placing an obligation to, though.
I know.
I
and
definitely
think-
have done that where I've been like, we designed a thing and thought it was going to do X on implementation. It turns out it's
Not so
done
much.
Y.
Yeah.
And now we're I think you know, like it's.
I agree. I just think
It's hard.
there are people who would consider that career limiting behaviour.
And there are agencies where it would be career limiting behaviour. Like I don't want to pretend like that's
Yeah.
not a thing. Yeah.
Goes back to our old leadership culture question.
And why you need to say out loud that these things are expectations so that people are like, well, I was told by the APSC that actually it is my job to join these dots.
Yeah. And so I'm going to do it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Like I do think there's something really important about these findings as giving people permission to do that. Like a kind of,
I agree.
soz boss.
I agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and I also think what's different about them is, unlike the Robodebt Royal Commission, they're actual public service words, and they're not about the content, because what they are saying is failing to act on truthfulness given all the information. So it's not about Robodebt, it's saying that is a form of misconduct. And it's being really explicit about it. And so if you were inclined to go, it was them over there, it was a failure of lots of things, it was political, like lots of the kind of excuses you can hear, distancing you can hear. This really kind of takes your knees out a little bit because it provides the obligations, it's not about...
It's a build-out of substance about what constitutes misconduct
Yeah.
in a way that we can't, similar to how we build out the common law, that as we see things and say, no, that counts. So obviously that was the kind of general breaches. We, of course, know there were this whole cast of characters variously involved in Robodebt. What were the findings regarding named people?
So there are only 2 people named in this finding, and that's itself a matter of kind of some controversy, and they were both secretaries. So the first, I'll take them in turn maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. So we'll start with Secretary Catherine Campbell. She had 6 findings relating to her, 4 relating to that early 2017 period when they suddenly realised that like lots of things have gone wrong, and that includes things like failure to get legal advice, failure to follow up on whistleblowers. She gets a specific finding about failing to follow up on the Peter Hanks QC/KC speech at the admin law thing.
Conference, yeah.
Yep, and failure to inform the minister of this controversy around that. So there's 4 findings there. She gets 1 which is around creating a culture that prevented issues from being raised, including aggressive and abusive behaviour from a deputy secretary. So it's really explicitly said out loud.
Yeah.
That is a failure. And then there's a last one which is about recommencing the process in August 2017, that she allowed it to resume when she knew or should have known that the debts were inaccurate. And so they're all failures to act with due care and diligence. And they're all failures, they're all contraventions of the APS values. That's how they were all classified. Interestingly, there were 3 things that were said in the Royal Commission report that were explicitly not found. So it was found that she didn't mislead Cabinet in the MPP. It was found that she didn't kill the request for legal advice on her return from leave in 2017. So that was the Barry Jackson request that went missing. And it was found that she didn't not fulfil her legal obligations with regard to the PwC contract, which is code for saying they didn't find that she killed the long report and received the PowerPoint instead, or that if she did that was kind of a contravention of the contract. I think a number of those findings, given that Melissa Golightly is deceased and there's a kind of a big evidentiary gap, it's not surprising actually they couldn't draw those links, because that's like the person who otherwise made some of those decisions. Now, so she's come out and done a big splash in the Australian with an excellent photo, and it says that DSS was in charge of knowing the legalities. So how can she have 4 findings against her in relation to legality? She says she never knew about the culture until the inquiry. No idea that she was running a culture with an abusive and aggressive DepSec. And she says, she's a scapegoat, and that there are other people, in particular Secretary Finn Pratt, who was the Secretary of DSS, who should have been named by this and should have been sanctioned by this, and they get away with it because they're, I don't know, boys or close to the government or whatever. But that's her kind of story, is she has just been stood up as a scapegoat in relation to this.
I have a little bit to say about that.
Do you?
Oh, you look, a couple of things. The not knowing about culture. Oh, look, actually, if we take it up to the top, is scapegoat another word for I'm in charge of the place?
Yeah, that's such a good observation. You're right. That's so true.
What happened to the buck stops with me?
Yeah.
So, in some ways,
yes.
if you just change all the words around, and I'm not suggesting you do that, but if you read it in a different way, it's like they're saying I was responsible for everything that happened here. And I'm like, yeah, that is kind of what they're saying.
Yeah.
And you can have a problem with that, I suppose.
Yeah, you can disagree.
But I think that's the question, right? Like, they're arguing that I'm responsible for everything that happened underneath me, and
how unfair.
And I dismiss that, and I feel that's unfair. And someone that she can take that position, that's okay.
Yeah.
I also just then go, I seriously hope our leaders across every state and every territory and every part of the Commonwealth, et cetera, do not hold the view that being accountable for everything that happen in your agency makes you a scapegoat, because that's not a culture I think we should encourage.
Absolutely.
The culture thing, I did wonder if she read her own version of whatever they called their surveys and the digging down. I mean, I have worked for CEs who not only when they get the red flags, and of course every state and jurisdiction is a bit different, so just work in the generalities, but when they know that this unit didn't get great results, ask for regular updates on what then happened, if you got a consultant in, what was the report back.
Exactly.
And so I don't find that compelling because there was feedback on the culture in the agency. There could have been more. You could argue that if you'd had a robust internal industrial relations system, the behaviour of a deputy secretary might have come to light because you could have created a complaints and investigation system. But it's not like there wasn't a way to know about the culture in your own agency.
I'm prepared to accept that she, as a person, did not know about the culture, but I don't think that's an acceptable defence. It was her job to know about the culture and how that influenced the proper behaviour of the people within it.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not actually prepared to accept that she didn't know about the culture, because some of the reflections, so for example, that Secretary Leon makes about the culture that she joined into, are that at the very senior levels, DepSecs were cutting each other's knees in particular meetings, right? And so the Secretary sees that behaviour, and either you notice it and you're condoning it, or you don't notice it, and that's a failure. Really big problem.
Yep.
So I think, to me, I'm not even kind of willing to give that pass. You are accountable for the culture in your agency.
Yep. And you may miss things, but that doesn't change the fact.
Yeah.
That you missed the signal, you didn't read the stuff properly, you were sitting in the room where DepSecs were cutting each other's knees, and you made a choice that it was creating healthy competition. Whatever.
Yeah.
Either way, you're still accountable for it.
Oh, agree.
In my view.
Yep. In your humble
So
opinion.
Renee Leon is is the other person named in the report. What does it say about her?
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying this is a much more controversial and challenging area, and we'll walk slowly through it. So the findings that are made against Renee Leon relate to sort of 4 things. So the first 2 are about misleading the Ombudsman in 2019, when first she had a meeting with the Ombudsman to seek his removal from an implementation report of reference to legal uncertainty about the basis of Robodebt, and then second, where she explicitly said some things about there being legal certainty. both of which were manifestly untrue, and she acknowledged that in her oral evidence. She knew there was legal uncertainty. They'd just received the prospects advice for Masterton. Like, it was clear that there was legal uncertainty, and she sort of said, well, I didn't think it was helpful to ventilate that through an ombudsman's report, and she had reasons for thinking about that. That was found to be, both of those were found to be breaches of the requirement to act honestly and with integrity, breaches of the requirement to act with care and diligence, and to not provide false or misleading information in response to an official request. So there were 3 breaches each against those. The third circumstance, so 2 about the Ombudsman, the third one was about not getting that Solicitor General's advice commissioned quickly enough. Mm. And we talked about this in an earlier episode. So they get the AGS prospects advice on Masterton in March, and they don't get the request to the Solicitor General until 5 months later.
Yeah.
And that was found to be a breach of the requirement to act with care and diligence and to uphold the APS values. And then the final one was around not telling the Minister or Secretary Campbell, as the Secretary of DSS, about the Solicitor General advice for 5 or 6 weeks, depending on which person you're talking about, once the Solicitor General's advice had come in. And again, that was found as to have breached the requirement to act with honesty and integrity, care and diligence, and to uphold the APS values. So I guess I want to say a few things and maybe throw it to the room. So the first is Secretary Leon ended Robodebt at incredible personal cost. She brought an end to it and she was sacked 2 weeks later. She is very clearly a person who went in and tried to do a really diligent and thorough job. She did a lot in relation to building a culture at DHS that allowed them to actually surface that it was illegal. Yep. Some of the legal advice that was commissioned, it's hard to imagine that having been commissioned under the previous culture. So it's clear, and that you can see that she was in a really, really difficult situation.
Yep.
Yes.
Really dysfunctional department.
Yep.
And she worked with integrity and kind of purpose and alacrity and all of the things. And you can see this now. On LinkedIn, you'll see a million comments under her posts about this, of just people saying, "You were a great leader. You were the only reason I could last this period. You gave us hope. You were part of the solution, not part of the problem."
Yep.
And I've said this to you guys before. I really think of Robodebt as having elements of a Greek tragedy. And what's the difference between a Greek tragedy and a tragedy? A Greek tragedy is you've got like a hero with a fatal flaw, right? Mm. And you can be both the person who did everything to end it and also the person who misled the Ombudsman
and didn't act
quickly enough. Okay. Those things can coexist. And so personally, she's come out and she said, look, I'm horrified by what happened during Robodebt. I did everything I could to end it. I don't think it's super fair that I've been named in this way. What I wish she had said was, I did everything I could, or I thought that I could, and I see now that I made compromises on that journey that crossed lines. And let's talk about what those lines are, because at the time they didn't look crystal to me.
Yep. I agree.
And that's the learning moment, right?
It is. And to be reductive and bring it down to kind of good people and bad people really is super unhelpful, and I think doesn't, again, help us do better in the future, which for me has always been a huge part of the huge investment. I don't know how many people the APSC employed and NAC and the Royal Commission, but it's a lot. And it is not just about finding bad humans.
100%. It's about identifying opportunities for us all to improve our practice.
Yeah, and to not have these things happen. I think there's and I don't know, Caroline, if you will then potentially go and find out, I don't know what we're going to use as the intro for this particular episode, but when Jed Bartlett goes to take the censure from Congress for not revealing that he had MS in the West Wing, and everyone's trying to kind of talk him out of it and look at the politics of it, and in the end he says, it was wrong.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't do it with any malintent.
Absolutely.
I didn't think it was really anyone's business. It wasn't really impacting on the choice to make when you voted for me. But with reflection, these things are kind of in the public interest. And no, I am just going to cop that as the answer because it turns out I was actually wrong, and no one in public life says they're wrong anymore.
Absolutely.
And I just had that running around in my head yesterday, which is, he wasn't saying I'm an inherently evil person.
Yes.
He was saying on this one, I
got them
didn't
wrong.
get it right.
Yeah.
I got it wrong, and I want to lead by showing that I can say that out loud and give others kind of an idea that if you're wrong, you're not bad. It's the difference between shame and guilt for me.
Yeah.
Guilt is, I was wrong and I'm going to do something to fix it.
Absolutely.
Shame is kind of an inherent, often is something that you just sticks around a lot more. And I just find that a lot of this is about that difference between guilt and shame, and that difference between taking responsibility and not, and that capacity to say you were wrong about something without saying you are always wrong, or you are not bright, or you are not able to do your job.
Yeah. Or, in fact, I think it's the reverse. You are always right. You are, and I think that's the thing, is that there's a real identity around. An identity of integrity is an identity of integrity that always gets things right. And I find that incredibly dangerous.
Yes.
Because actually, when I think about every time I encounter an integrity issue or an investigation or something like that, I really have to talk to people who know the thing to kind of pick through, okay, why is this information confidential? What's the obligation? Like, you really have to actually get to the basic core of, like, what is the thing here? Let's talk about it. Let's throw it around. Let's work it out. It's not a black or white. It's not like if you're a good person, you know the right answer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you have to show out loud. So, I mean, what Secretary Leon's...
they were line ball calls.
They were line ball calls.
And you make line ball calls, and you don't always make them on the right side of the line.
Yeah.
And some of the best leaders I've worked for with the most integrity, I can think of things where I, if I had been in their chair, would have picked a different side of that line, but I can easily see how they found themselves on the side of the line that they found themselves on.
It was open to them to behave the way they did or make that choice.
Yeah, and her solicitors said in their submissions to the Royal Commission, and I just think it's so interesting, where they're talking about the delay of taking the Solicitor General's advice to the Minister, right? And what she says is, I wanted to have a fully defensible thing that said, I've looked at all the alternatives. This is the only thing that you can do.
Yes.
And her solicitors say that the delay was a short one, born of a reasonable desire to work through the implications of the Solicitor General's opinion, a justifiable concern that it would be leaked, and a judgment call that the best and fastest way to end the scheme was to work out how to do so. Now, that judgment call, which was, I'm trying to do the morally right thing, comes up against a very strict accountability in the Westminster system that you have to tell your minister, even if you don't trust him. Even if you think he might sack you with that information. Because that's really what she said. I mean, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but clearly she's thinking, I give him this without options.
And
he's going to go out loud and say, oh, that's right, I'm just going to do this other thing that's also illegal. And then I'm going to be wedged in the same spot, right? Like, she is clearly trying to line up all her ducks. And I am so sorry for her. You have to tell your minister.
You do.
And and you can't fib to the ombudsman. So I just think it's interesting in drawing bright lines. It helps you kind of examine.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So with this report, what are the consequences? What happens now that this report has been published?
Look, only 4 people remain in the public service. Those sanctions were listed for 5, so 1 retired or resigned before a sanction could be applied. For the 7 non-public servants, once it was finished, they have to disclose that misconduct finding for 5 years. And I think that that's not just in applying for roles with the public service. It's also for things like if you were working for a firm that consulted to them.
Yeah.
So it's got a slightly longer bow on it, which I think is a good thing. For the people in the public service, there were some demotions, some docking of pay and fines and telling offs. Some reductions of classifications, reprimands. I'm not sure what a reprimand looks like, to be perfectly honest.
Come to my house on a Sunday morning and you can see what a reprimand looks like.
I think it's a sternly worded letter.
Yes.
Oh, okay. No, that's not how I tell Ted off.
I think that there's an explicit part that says that if some of those people had not already retired or resigned, they would have been terminated. And I think there's an interesting thing. I know that in South Australia, if you do resign or retire mid-investigation, the findings are still found. Like, you can almost be terminated and a finding of misconduct in retrospect.
Interesting.
So it is not a kind of ripcord feeling. That, I think, has been raised in a few places in the last week around the APS, which is should they close that loophole of being able to kind of, once you end
Say
your
out loud.
employment, then you can no longer be kind of party to any outcome. So I think that's something to look at.
Can I just pause on that? Because I really think, like, my mum was reading, my mum was reading the outcomes of this, and she's like, oh, it's just like people got slaps on the wrist. And I'm like, yeah, but it's because the people they would have sacked got out first. And so it's actually bad for confidence in the public sector.
I agree.
That you can't say this person, we would have sacked 4 people. We went through the process of making that decision. Like, I think it undermines public confidence.
Yeah, and I don't think just in this particular case. I think there's another part of this that is problematic, which is the deterrence component is lost when people resign. So it gives the view, if you maybe weighing up your ethical considerations, that you can resign and go on with your career kind of untainted. Dignity
and tell your own story.
Yeah, and all of that kind of thing. So I think we need to start thinking about whether we've got the structures of that quite right. I think the other thing around this idea of shame, I know you're very interested in shame generally, Caroline, but the issue of naming people is a really interesting thing, and I think we've struggled in building our integrity bodies across the board. So, I mean, I know in South Australia it's a very public iterations around whether you name people who are being investigated, like the New South Wales model is a very public hearing model, and whether you are found or otherwise, like the process itself can be very damaging to your reputation.
Yeah.
I actually don't have a view of, I don't think we've nailed it anywhere.
No, that's right.
I don't think we've nailed it anywhere. I don't think the perp walk's a good idea.
No.
Yeah. I think it stops good process. I don't think doing everything in secret's a good idea, and I'm just not sure. It's something in the middle, but I can't think of a model that meets it well.
Because public shame and opprobrium is, a pretty effective.
But only after you've been, but only after you've been found, though.
Agreed. Yes,
that's I think part of the balance. Caroline's not sure.
I'm not sure because of the I don't know, there's something about how finely passed all of the findings and the not findings were. I mean, I guess everyone in this case, I can sort of take a punt at thinking about who the 12 are. I don't know.
You have to have findings, in my view, for names. I don't like the idea of
naming people without
because I think
determination.
And I don't mean in this case. We're talking generally about integrity investigations. I mean, the Royal Commission was very public. Yeah. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this general idea of when do you name versus when do you not name. And I think you have to have findings. That's my personal view before there are naming. I don't think, but once there are findings, though, I don't think that
necessarily means you name.
No, I don't think the reverse. I think once there is findings, I think that should be public information, whether you have left the job or otherwise.
Did you see that NAC put out its first statement, maybe it was last week or the week before, of a not finding? So this is part of the legislative regime under the NAC, is to say, we were asked to look into this and we can tell you we've exonerated so-and-so.
Interesting.
Right. And I thought, that's actually a pretty good answer to some of the scuttlebutt is and it was, when you read the thing, it was kind of seemed like a relatively vexatious complaint had been made against someone, but it had been doing the rounds on the internet multiple times. Yeah. Right. And so now there's a thing that says, not here.
We have officially looked into it.
It also makes me laugh in the sense of how much work goes into these things and that they get their credit. It's this thing of that thing where you look into something for ages and ages and decide not to do it so no one ever knows how much time you spent on it. I want my homework marked. A minister had this great idea, or someone had a great idea, and I spent so long and it all just fizzled out because actually all of it wasn't a thing, and no one's ever going to know how hard that was. I can just imagine that component of it.
So can we talk a little bit about any other kind of themes that came out from that report?
Look, I think that there's a lot in there around not just focusing on government delivery and government priorities, and I really think that expanded responsibility around good policy. I mean, being legal, even the biggest dunce in the public service was pretty clear that that was a rule.
Yep.
I think the expansion of the idea around you just can't deliver. You have much bigger responsibilities to good policy than I believe is probably what most people think.
Yeah.
You have a real duty to think about whether the work is ethical and what it's going to look like and its operational implications. Like, effectively, one of my big bugbears, it effectively has that thing of like, as the secretary, you had to be able to fill out the form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was your job.
Yeah.
So I think the other really interesting one is you cannot delegate your accountability. So going back to that conversation we were having before, like, is a scapegoat just another word for, like, it's my job?
The person in charge. Yeah.
They do make a point that it's not about micromanagement. So it's that mix of, like, systems and curiosity and signals and patterns. I would say reporting anyway. If they'd had reports from the AOT, they would have found this, like, complaints reports, my usual story. So it's not about, like, being able to stand over the shoulders of 4,000 people who work for you.
Yeah. And in fact, that's going to mean you don't do the
right
people
thing
won't do the right. You'll miss everything.
Yeah, it's a completely different thing, but I think that is also in there.
I liked in that sort of conversation, there was a bit in there also about making sure that teams have the resources, the capability and the information to do the job well.
Yeah.
And I really, I have been guilty of this in the past, of having quite brilliant ideas, if I do say so myself, and kind of launching them into the world, and then not being diligent in the follow-up of making sure that there was a competent framework to put it in. And I've watched some of those things play out over time. And I actually, in the first instance, it's so funny, I blamed the people who weren't doing a good job of it. But afterwards I was like, actually, maybe my brilliant idea was not super implementable, and actually I needed to make sure that there was a person that could fit this specific hole before I launched it. And I have a lot of regrets about that.
Yeah. I think this also has a lot in it about creating integrity organisations and records and whatever else, but some of this will actually come up in some of our Ask Us Anything episodes. So I think we can put a pin, and because we've got some other bits on that coming up. And so I think in some ways it goes to all of our greatest hits. I think some of it is an expansion of what we thought were ideal, and the ASPC is now saying are a requirement. You have a positive duty, but I think a lot of it is not surprising.
Can we just touch on, and kind of with reflection on Renee Leon, is I was too busy to deal with that for 5 weeks, an excuse. Mm-hmm. And can we talk about note-taking? Because I know both of those came up.
So, the report notes the enormous workloads of the SES involved in the people that they were investigating, and says that agencies need to make sure that people are appropriately supported with their workloads. But it also has this great line where it says, also, SES are the only people who have the ability to create the space and capacity to perform their roles with care and diligence. And I was thinking about that, and I'm like, it is so true. As a senior burger, you are able to actually say, I'm going to have 3 hours in my week where I don't do things. And of course everyone say, but I can't because I'm so busy. But you know what? You never get to the bottom of your to-do list.
No.
Yeah.
Right? So you're just taking one more thing that's not going to get done on your to-do list. You can and should, I think, invest some reflective time that makes you sort of think, probably should follow up on whether that legal advice has been got to yet. I just think, and it was a beautiful framing, because it stopped SES being victims of their busyness, which I know I have felt.
I think we all have.
Yeah, right. And then it's like, oh no, that's right. We're the only people who can make us not victims of our business. We are the only people who can make that space in our lives.
Yeah. I recall giving coaching to another executive once who was complaining about how busy he was and how he never got a chance to do these things. And I'm like, so you just make the time.
Yeah.
You block it out in your calendar.
Exactly.
You forgo something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop
Choose
acting
different
like,
things.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop acting like everything you're spending time on is critical.
Oh, yes, it's so true. Yes. And note keeping, there's a really brilliant recommendation, or it's not really a recommendation.
We'll send it to you for Christmas.
Yeah.
Oh.
You will love it.
Pop it in a frame for you.
It's literally we need to make sure that when SES leave the service, they leave their written notebooks so that they don't walk away with all of this kind of formal knowledge of what has happened, and that people should do diary notes.
People take proper diary notes anymore, but anyway, we've
There's
covered that
also one
before.
about that as well. Yep.
So in the end, I guess it all feels a bit anticlimactic. What's missing?
Look, I mentioned the Greek tragedy before in relation to Secretary Leon, and I would say the other thing that's Greek tragedy about this is that we're all having a conversation that's completely oblivious to the suffering of the peasants, which in this case is all the victims of Robodebt, right? So, like, the APSC findings are of interest to us because we are interested in the public service, but it is not... It is a very patrician kind of worry to think about the bosses. And so I do just want to say out loud, I know there are a lot of people who are really angry about these findings and aren't finding the kind of, they're not finding the justice.
Accountability and responsibility and justice. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think we can ever underestimate how important it is to hear things like, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I believe you.
Yeah.
And we create so much mess and process to avoid saying, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I believe you.
On that note, till next time.
Right. No one in government takes responsibility for anything anymore. I was wrong. I was wrong. Come on, we know that. Lots of times we don't know what right or wrong is, but lots of times we do, and come on, this is one. I may not have had sinister intent at the outset, but there were plenty of opportunities for me to make it right. No one in government takes responsibility for anything anymore. We foster, we obfuscate, we rationalize. Everybody does it. That's what we say. So we come to occupy a moral safe house where everyone's to blame, so no one's guilty. I'm to blame. I was wrong.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.